In the glittering world of the ultra-rich, some women are trophies. Vanessa Langford was meant to be a monument for 15 years. She stood as the silent, elegant wife of billionaire tycoon Nathan Langford, a woman who weathered his public scandals with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. But dignity has its limits, and loyalty has its price. When Nathan makes the fatal error of publicly replacing her with his young mistress at the city's most important gala, he assumes he has finally broken her. He is wrong tonight. Vanessa Langford will not be a silent monument. She will be a storm, and she will be wearing red. The grand ballroom of the Rosemont Grand Hotel was a galaxy of man-made stars, a universe of glittering diamonds, shimmering silks, and blinding ambition, all orbiting the gravitational pull of old money and new power. This was the annual Bay Area Cultural Trust Gala, the undisputed pinnacle of San Francisco's philanthropic calendar. To be here was to be someone. To be seen here was to matter, and no one mattered more tonight, it seemed, than Nathan Langford and the woman on his arm. The CEO of Langford International Ventures was a man carved from granite and arrogance. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored with surgical precision. He moved through the crowd not like a guest, but like a feudal lord surveying his lands. Every handshake was a bestowal of favor, every laugh a calculated display of dominance. And on his arm, clinging to him like the most exquisite of parasites, was Sophie Renaud. She was 20 years his junior, a former model whose career had been launched by Nathan's patronage. Her dress was a cascade of silver sequins, a direct challenge to the crystal chandeliers above. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with woo-hungry eyes that darted around the room, cataloging every rival, every socialite, every wife she had successfully supplanted. If only for the evening, she was the living, breathing symbol of Nathan's power. A man so wealthy, so influential. He didn't need to hide his indiscretions. He could parade them on the most public of stages. They were a picture of triumph, a king and his chosen consort, holding court. "Darling," Sophie purred, her French accent thick and deliberate, her lips close to Nathan's ear. "The Hawthorns are staring. I think Evelyn Whitmore is about to have an aneurysm." "Her pearls look practically yellow with envy," Sophie murmured, her voice like velvet smoke. Nathan chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of pure satisfaction. He gave her hand a light squeeze. "Let them stare, they're yesterday's news, we're the headline." He swept his gaze across the room, eyes sliding over clusters of whispering guests. The whispers were for him. He knew that, about his audacity, about his spectacular new plaything. He thrived on it. It was more exhilarating than any billion-dollar acquisition. A junior associate from his firm, a nervous young man named Eli, approached, balancing 2 flutes of champagne. "Mr. Langford, Miss Renaud, an absolute vision, as always." "Thank you, Eli," Nathan replied coolly, taking both glasses and handing one to Sophie. He didn't introduce her. He didn't need to. Her role was obvious. "Anything to report from the floor?" "Just that everyone's buzzing about the Singapore project, sir." "Bold move." "The board's ecstatic," Eli added with a tentative smile. "The board's paid to be ecstatic," Nathan muttered, his eyes already drifting past the young man in search of someone more interesting to engage. It was in that moment, at the height of his unshakable confidence, that the universe quietly shifted. The great walnut doors of the ballroom, closed for nearly half an hour, creaked open. A rare event, once the cocktail hour was underway. The sudden influx of lobby light and ambient sound drew a few curious glances. One glance turned into two turned into a dozen. A ripple of stillness spread from the entrance, a hush that rippled outward, extinguishing the ambient hum of the room. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The string quartet, playing a spirited Vivaldi allegro, suddenly sounded jarring in the spreading silence. Nathan, mildly annoyed by the disruption, turned his head. His smile, still fixed from his previous conversation, lingered like a mask. He expected a late politician, a headline-chasing celebrity, someone craving attention. He did not expect to see his wife. Vanessa Langford stood framed in the doorway, a portrait of impossible elegance. For 15 years, she had been the ideal executive's wife, tastefully dressed in muted tones, her hair always swept into a conservative twist. Her presence had been as steady and discreet as the quarterly returns from a reliable mutual fund. She was the ghost behind the curtain, the silent partner who planned every dinner, ran every household, raised their 2 children, and endured his serial indiscretions with unnerving grace. He hadn't seen her in 3 weeks. Not since he'd told her he was bringing Sophie to the gala, and that it would be simpler if she stayed behind at their Napa Valley estate. He had expected and received her usual quiet acquiescence, but the woman standing in the doorway was not that Vanessa. This woman was a phoenix, a flame, a reckoning. She was wearing a dress the color of arterial blood. It was a simple yet devastatingly effective column of crimson silk that clung to her figure in a way that was both refined and provocative. It bared her shoulders, showcasing the elegant line of her collarbone. Her hair, typically pinned in a no-nonsense chignon, was loose, styled in soft waves cascading over one shoulder. Around her neck was a strand of raw, unpolished diamonds, like captured starlight. Her lips matched her gown in a bold, unyielding shade of red. She wasn't just wearing a dress, she was wearing a message, a declaration of war, stitched in silk and defiance. The room, already quiet, now held its collective breath. This wasn't a scandal, it was theater, grand, high, and terrible. Vanessa's eyes, cool, clear, steely gray, swept across the ballroom. She wasn't looking for anyone, she wasn't searching for him. Her gaze was serene, regal, as though she were the host and the others mere guests at her event. She took a single, deliberate step forward, then another. The doors behind her closed with a heavy thud, locking everyone inside. Nathan stood frozen. The champagne glass in his hand trembled slightly. The color had drained from his face, leaving a pale mask of disbelief. The arm he draped around Sophie's waist went slack. A slow, creeping dread began to coil in his spine. A primal fear he hadn't felt since childhood. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Nathan? Who is that? Sophie's voice was sharp and brittle. The sultry purr was gone, replaced by the hiss of a cornered animal. She already knew, of course. The resemblance to the faded photos she'd once glimpsed in Nathan's office was unmistakable. But this version wasn't faded. She was vivid. Fierce. Terrifying. Nathan couldn't speak. He couldn't look away from her. It was as if he were seeing Vanessa for the first time. The quiet, mousy woman he'd married for her pedigree and strategic value, she was gone. In her place stood a force of fire and ice. A woman who commanded an entire room with nothing but her presence. Vanessa began to move. She didn't march. She drifted, a scarlet ghost through a sea of black and white. She smiled at people as she passed, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She touched the arm of Caroline Wu, the museum's formidable director. She exchanged a few quiet words with Judge Ellison, who regarded her now with unexpected admiration. She was weaving through the crowd with a social grace Nathan had completely forgotten she possessed. She wasn't making a scene. She was reclaiming her ground. She was reminding everyone in that room exactly who the real Mrs. Langford was. Every step she took struck Nathan's carefully curated reality like a hammer. Every gracious nod, every sparkling smile she gave someone else was another twist of the knife in his gut. He had wanted to be the headline, but with a chilling certainty, he now knew he was no longer the story. He and the beautiful young woman beside him were suddenly, irrevocably, old news. The real event had just begun. And as Vanessa drew closer, her serene gray eyes finally briefly met his across the room. In that moment, Nathan understood. Her arrival wasn't a plea. It wasn't desperation. It was the opening shot in a war. A war he didn't even know had begun. The silence Vanessa had conjured in the ballroom was no longer a pause. It had become a living thing, a vacuum that sucked the very air out of the space. Then, as she moved deeper into the heart of the gala, the void began to fill again, this time with a different sound. The frenzied electric buzz of high society gossip. It began with whispers, muffled gasps, lips hidden behind sequined clutches, heads leaned in close. Then it spread, snowballing into a steady hum, a low, insistent, razor-sharp hum, the sound of 100 tiny engines of speculation roaring to life. Oh my God, is that Vanessa Langford? I thought she was in, what did he say, some sort of yoga retreat. That dress, it's custom. That's a De Laurentiis original. I saw it on the Paris runway. He must have pulled it just for her. Look at Nathan, he looks like he's seen a ghost. Worse, someone whispered, their voice gleeful. He's seeing his future, and it's wearing red. Nathan heard it all. The words lapped at him like waves of acid eating away at the foundation he had built. He was used to being the subject of conversation, but admired, envied. This was something else. This was mockery. He was the joke now, a punchline in the very narrative he had crafted for himself. His knuckles whitened around the stem of his champagne flute. Beside him, Sophie stood frozen, her body tense with fury. Her perfectly manicured fingers were digging into his arm now. What had started as Sophie's playful cling had become a desperate, painful grip. "Nathan, do something," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "She's humiliating us." "She's humiliating me." Everyone's laughing. But Nathan couldn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed by a potent mix of anger, disbelief, and something else entirely. Fear. Vanessa was supposed to be shattered. She was supposed to be back at their sprawling, empty estate in Napa, crying over a forgotten cup of chamomile tea. Just another casualty of his whims. That was the natural order of their universe. But her presence here, in that dress with that unshakable confidence, was a cosmic glitch. It shattered every rule he thought he had authored. It was like watching a ghost return, only stronger, more radiant, and fully in control. She wasn't haunting the room. She was commanding it. Every step she took was a message, not just to him but to everyone who had ever doubted her. Vanessa continued her slow, deliberate glide through the room, a tactician. A queen on the chessboard, moving with icy precision. She didn't look at them again. She didn't have to. She was greeting, strategically, the very people Nathan most needed to win over. She stopped by Kenji Sakamoto, the Japanese tech mogul Nathan had been chasing for a year over a lucrative joint venture. Vanessa shared a laugh with him, her head tilting back just slightly, the diamonds on her neck catching the chandelier light. Sakamoto, known for being notoriously unreadable, laughed out loud with her. A broad, genuine grin. To the rest of the room, it looked effortless. But to Nathan, it felt like a calculated blow to the gut. She hadn't just stolen his moment, she had stolen the leverage. Nathan felt panic rise in his chest. He had been trying to schedule a private dinner with Kenji for 6 months. And now, Vanessa had accomplished more with one shared joke than Nathan had with 2/4 of strategy. She moved next to a small cluster that included Marcus Ellington, Nathan's oldest and most ruthless business rival. A corporate predator who could sense vulnerability before it bled. Vanessa extended her hand to him, her voice carrying easily through the now hushed ballroom. "Marcus," she said, "how wonderful to see you. You're looking well." A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face as he took her hand and held it just a beat too long. "Vanessa, my dear," Marcus said, "the pleasure is entirely mine. You are a revelation." Then his eyes flicked to Nathan. The look in them, pure electric schadenfreude. He was savoring every second of Nathan's very public undoing. And Nathan, once so untouchable, felt like he was on display, naked beneath a microscope held by people who used to fear him. And then Nathan realized this wasn't some emotional meltdown he could dismiss. This wasn't hysteria. There were no tears, no pleading. This was a chess game. Vanessa was executing a precise, calculated dismantling of his credibility, his standing, his power. She was showing every key player in the room that she wasn't some discarded name in his shadow. Sophie was a distraction. Vanessa was legacy. Finally, the trance broke, spurred by another sharp pinch from Sophie. Nathan moved. He set his glass down with a dull thud, straightened his jacket, and strode toward his wife, thunder etched into every line of his face. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. "I'll handle this," he muttered to Sophie, leaving her standing alone, sparkling, silent, and suddenly irrelevant. He reached Vanessa just as she was turning away from Marcus Ellington. He grabbed her arm, too hard. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he growled, voice low but unable to mask the fury twisting his expression. Vanessa didn't flinch. She didn't yank her arm back. She simply turned her cool gray eyes on him. Up close, Nathan could see the fine lines at their corners, lines he had etched there over the years. But tonight they didn't speak of sorrow. They looked like battle scars. There was a steadiness in her gaze that unsettled him deeply, like she had already rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. And now that it had arrived, it wasn't anger she carried. It was certainty. "I'm attending a gala, Nathan," she replied, her voice level. "Just like you." "I believe the invitation says Mr. and Mrs. Nathan Langford, or did you have it reprinted?" Her calmness burned hotter than any tears could have. "You were supposed to be in Napa," he hissed. "We agreed." No, she cut in, her voice lowering slightly, slicing like glass. You told me what you decided. There was no agreement. I've simply decided to renegotiate the terms of our arrangement. Marcus, who hadn't wandered far, let out a quiet chuckle. Nathan shot him a glare sharp enough to cut stone. This is not the time or the place, Vanessa. It seems like the perfect time and place, she said, glancing around. There was a gleam in her eye, cool, measured, unblinking, as though she were cataloging every reaction, every whisper, every eye turning toward them. She wasn't just speaking to Nathan, she was speaking to the room. Everyone's here. Our friends, your investors, your guest. Her eyes flicked briefly to Sophie. Whatever flashed across them, pity, warning, contempt, vanished before he could read it. It's just more efficient this way. That's when he noticed it, tucked neatly under her arm. A sleek crimson leather portfolio. The color matched her dress exactly. It was slim, not more than a few dozen pages at most. And yet, in this context, in this moment, it suddenly felt heavy enough to sink an empire. A low pulse began in his temples, a beat of dread that grew louder with each breath. He had seen briefcases like that before. At regulatory meetings, in boardrooms before lawsuits. Never ever in the hands of his wife. His stomach twisted. Divorce papers? Photographs? Something worse? The renegotiation no longer sounded like a marital spat. It felt like a corporate coup. What is that? He demanded, eyes narrowing toward the folder. A soft, unreadable smile curved her lips. Just a little light reading for later, she said. Something I might share with some of my new friends. She patted Marcus Ellington's arm gently. Marcus was just telling me how much he appreciates your aggressive business style. He's particularly intrigued by the Phoenix Initiative. Nathan's blood went cold. The Phoenix Initiative. A highly leveraged, ethically murky deal he'd pushed through with creative accounting and a maze of shell corporations. It had been his greatest triumph, but also his greatest vulnerability. No one was ever supposed to know the real architecture of the Phoenix Initiative. Certainly not Vanessa. How could she possibly? Nathan's mind reeled. Jumping back 3 months, those late nights at home, the confidential documents he'd carelessly left out in his study, the hushed, angry phone calls he'd taken out in the garden, assuming she was asleep or too distracted by her charity board meetings and design workshops to notice. He had underestimated her. He had committed the cardinal sin of any predator. He'd forgotten his prey had teeth. You have no idea what you're talking about, he hissed, a desperate bluff. Don't I? Vanessa replied, her smile icy and unreadable. It didn't reach her eyes. I've had so much free time lately, Nathan, an abundance of it. You wouldn't believe what a woman can learn when she's no longer occupied with polishing her husband's reputation. With a quiet, deliberate motion, she extracted her arm from his grasp. Her touch was light, but absolute. Now, if you'll excuse me, she said, her tone slipping easily back into pleasant small talk. I believe they're about to serve the salmon, and I just spotted an old friend from my Stanford days. She paused. Her husband happens to sit on the board of the SEC. We have so much to catch up on. Then she turned and walked away, the red silk of her dress trailing behind her like a matador's cape, one who had just made the first clean cut. Nathan remained frozen. The music, the murmurs, the clinking of glasses, it all fell away into a low, disorienting hum. All he could hear was the thunder in his own chest. The empire he had built, of wealth, control, indulgence without consequence, was beginning to crack. He had entered the ballroom a king. He was rapidly becoming a cautionary tale. And as he watched Vanessa, this stranger in a scarlet gown, charm his allies and rivals alike, Nathan felt a sick certainty settle in his gut. This wasn't the end of his downfall. It was only the beginning. The spectacle of Nathan Langford being publicly undone by his own wife was intoxicating to the city's elite. What had started as whispers was now a living force in the room, a buzz that shimmered through every corner like static. Every eye was engaged in the silent ballet of scandal. They danced between the 3 points of the triangle, Vanessa triumphant, Nathan unraveling, Sophie floundering in the shadows. Because Sophie Renaud was not accustomed to being irrelevant. She had spent the last 5 years of her life turning beauty into a weapon, leveraging it to secure a spot beside Nathan Langford that every social climber in San Francisco dreamed of. Now she stood alone, half-shadowed beside a towering floral arrangement, a glass of untouched champagne trembling in her hand, watching her future disintegrate. Men who once couldn't resist orbiting her now avoided eye contact, giving her a wide berth like she was contagious. Women who used to glare at her with envy now looked at her with something far crueler: pity. She turned her gaze to Vanessa, now seated at a prime table, the very table Nathan himself had arranged, laughing effortlessly with the SEC board member's wife. Vanessa looked radiant, powerful, unreachable. Sophie's beauty, so potent just an hour ago, suddenly felt artificial, garish, in comparison to Vanessa's quiet, ageless grace. The silver sequins of her gown, once her armor, now clung to her like a jester's costume. Panic, sharp and icy, clawed at her chest. She had given up everything for this life. She had turned her back on her family, ghosted her old friends, endured the disdain of every high society wife she had replaced, all for the promise. The promise of becoming the next Mrs. Langford. A promise Nathan had whispered to her in five-star hotel rooms from Paris to Dubai. A promise that now rang as empty as the hollow look on his face. She had to act. She had to shift the story. Spotting Nathan, rigid and stunned near the bar, she composed herself, fixed a dazzling smile on her lips, and began her approach. Her walk was choreographed, hips swaying with precision, a reminder to him and everyone else watching of what he was about to walk away from. "Darling," she said, her voice a shade too bright, too rehearsed. She slipped her arm through his, pressing her body to his side. "There you are. I was starting to feel so lonely. Let's go grab a drink, forget all this drama." Nathan flinched at her touch as if burned. His mind was an inferno of dread and fury, consumed by two words: Phoenix Initiative. How much did Vanessa know? What could she prove? That crimson portfolio she carried wasn't just a threat, it was a live grenade. "Not now, Sophie," he snapped, yanking his arm away with a harsh, dismissive shove. It was the first time he'd ever been that blunt with her. In public, no less, and it hit her harder than a slap. "What do you mean, not now?" she demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. "Nathan, she's making a mockery of you. Of us. Are you just going to stand here and let her?" "You don't understand," he muttered, eyes darting across the ballroom, frantically scanning for Vanessa, for that damned crimson portfolio. "This is more complicated than you think." "It's not complicated." Sophie's voice sharpened with desperation, and she leaned in recklessly. "She's a washed-up old woman, clinging to scraps. You need to remind everyone who she really is, who you're really with. Show them who's won." But the words meant to rally him only cut deeper. Pathetic old woman. Looking at Vanessa across the ballroom, radiating more power and poise than he'd ever seen, one phrase echoed through Nathan's mind. And who has won? An hour ago, he would have scoffed at the question. Now, the answer was terrifyingly unclear. But Sophie, blinded by panic, refused to accept the shift. She saw her dream slipping through her fingers and made a fatal miscalculation. If Nathan wouldn't confront Vanessa, she would. Jaw tight, eyes blazing with reckless resolve, she turned and began storming across the ballroom, directly toward Vanessa's table. "Sophie, no," Nathan hissed. But it was too late. She was already halfway there. A fresh hush rippled across the room. The collective anticipation was electric. This was the scene they'd all been waiting for. Vanessa noticed her immediately. She gently paused her conversation, placed her napkin on the table, and turned with the composed air of a monarch receiving a jester. Sophie approached, her spine rod straight, radiating indignation. She ignored the other guests at the table, her eyes locked solely on Vanessa. "I think you've had your fun," Sophie began, her voice taut with barely suppressed fury. "You've made your little spectacle. It's time for you to go home." Vanessa looked up, tilting her head slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone impeccably polite but sharp as glass. "Have we been introduced? I'm Vanessa Langford." She extended a hand. The gesture, gracious, condescending, was a slap in the face cloaked in civility. Sophie didn't take the hand. "I know who you are," she spat. "You're the past, I'm the future. Nathan is with me now. You need to accept that and leave with some dignity." The word dignity dropped like a stone between them. A catastrophic misfire. Vanessa let a small, pitying smile curve her lips. "Dignity," she repeated softly, tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice." Then her voice cooled to ice. "Tell me, Miss Renaud, is it dignified to accept jewelry purchased from a joint marital account? To vacation in homes legally owned, at least in part, by the woman you're attempting to replace? I'm only asking, she added, because the legal definitions of these things are about to become very relevant to you. The color drained from Sophie's face. She had always assumed Nathan's wealth was endless, amorphous, untouchable. She had never once considered the legal frameworks that upheld all of it, the fine print, the dividing lines between his and theirs. But Vanessa had. And her voice, though never raised, hit like a scalpel. You see, she said, calm as glass, you think this is a competition over a man. That's your first mistake. Her eyes didn't waver. I'm not competing, she continued, each word a precision strike. I'm liquidating an asset, a very underperforming one, I might add. She cast a casual glance toward Nathan, who stood motionless in the middle of the ballroom, stricken as the entire scene unfolded around him. You believe you've won something, Vanessa said, turning her gaze back to Sophie's pale, stunned face. But all you've done is chain yourself to the anchor I'm about to cut loose. I genuinely wish you the best of luck with him. A small pause. Based on his recent financials, you're going to need it. She picked up her wine glass, took a delicate sip, then turned back to the conversation at her table. Now, where were we, Cynthia? You were telling me about your son's startup. Dismissal. Total. Surgical. Devastating. Sophie was left standing there, speechless, exposed, annihilated. She had charged across the ballroom to put Vanessa in her place. But Vanessa had just shown her, publicly, unflinchingly, that she never had a place to begin with. She was a footnote in a much larger story, a temporary variable in a long-running equation. Tears welled, rage, shame, panic. She turned her eyes to Nathan, pleading silently for him to intervene, to rescue her from the wreckage. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His focus was fixed on Vanessa. Or rather, on the slim crimson portfolio resting beside her plate like a loaded gun. The mistress who had once made him feel powerful, now was nothing more than white noise. An echo lost in the roar of a far more immediate threat. Vanessa. Defeated, Sophie turned and fled, head down, shoulders tight, weaving blindly through the tables and stairs. Her once stunning silver gown now glittered like a neon sign announcing her disgrace. Nathan didn't even flinch as she disappeared. He took a shaky step toward Vanessa's table. His mind spiraled. Financials, liquidating an asset. What did she know? What was in that portfolio? He had to find out. He had to stop her. His company, his name, his entire existence, everything hung in the balance now. The battle for the mistress was already lost. The war for his survival had just entered a terrifying new phase. The Gala, once a glittering showcase of power and culture, had become Nathan Langford's personal purgatory. The very air seemed thick with humiliation. Sophie's tear-streaked, panicked retreat had been the prelude. The real reckoning had yet to unfold. Nathan could feel the eyes, hundreds of them, tracking his every move, every breath. This was no longer a soiree. It was a coliseum. And he was the gladiator who had just dropped his sword. Each step he took felt like an execution march. Not to a battle, but to a judgment, one he couldn't escape. The click of cutlery and murmur of voices were replaced by the crushing weight of shame pressing down on his chest. His mind churned, a deafening blur. Financials, liquidation, SEC. Vanessa's words looped through his brain, each one a war drum pounding louder and louder. He had to get to her. He had to get that portfolio. He staggered forward, his body stiff, his steps disjointed, like a man trudging through waist-deep water. His breath came in ragged bursts. He was used to commanding attention, but now he could feel it consuming him, like fire licking at the edges of a paper-thin reputation. The whispers followed, slick, serpentine. As he neared her table, Vanessa looked up. The mask of polite dinner conversation had vanished. In its place, ice, precision, resolve. She saw him coming, and she was ready. With calm finality, she rested her hand on the crimson portfolio beside her plate. It wasn't a threat, it was a declaration. Vanessa, we need to talk, he said hoarsely as he reached her table. Now. Outside. I don't think so, Nathan, she replied evenly, not rising from her seat. I'm rather enjoying my dinner, and this conversation. She offered a warm smile to the SEC board member's wife, who immediately dropped her gaze, suddenly fascinated by her Chilean sea bass. No one wanted to be part of the blast radius. Even the air seemed to still, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. Please, don't do this, Nathan whispered, his voice cracking. The alpha male was gone. In his place stood a desperate, cornered man. "Whatever you think you know, whatever this is, we can work it out. Privately." "Privately?" Vanessa echoed, tilting her head. "Is that how you handled Sophie? Privately? Or the three before her?" She didn't blink. "You made your decisions in public, Nathan. Seems only fair that you should face the consequences the same way." From the corner of his eye, Nathan spotted someone approaching. Marcus Ellington. Smirking. Calculated. He wasn't heading toward Vanessa's table directly, but his route was unmistakably orchestrated for maximum spectacle. He stopped right by her chair. "Everything all right over here, Vanessa?" Marcus asked, feigning concern. "You look like someone's bothering you." His gaze locked onto Nathan's face, pale, glistening with sweat, and lit with malice. Before Nathan could growl at him to back off, to be continued. Vanessa responded before Nathan could open his mouth. She offered Marcus Ellington a dazzling smile. "Not at all, Marcus. Nathan and I were just having the most enlightening conversation about corporate transparency." The words slid out like a blade dipped in honey. "Ah, transparency," Marcus repeated, savoring it. "A noble ideal. So rare these days, especially on deals as intricate as the Phoenix Initiative." He turned slightly, directing his comment to Nathan, voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I've always wondered how you managed to engineer that arrangement, Nathan. Really, it's an artwork. The way those liabilities seem to vanish. Almost magical." Nathan felt his heart thunder against his ribs. A bead of sweat slid down the back of his neck, slow and deliberate, like time itself had started to mock him. His mouth went dry. He could feel the scrutiny sharpening around him, eyes narrowing, breaths held, as if everyone were leaning in for the kill. It was happening. The demolition he dreaded, the one he knew she was capable of, had begun. "Marcus, this is a private family matter," he managed, his voice tight, brittle. "It stopped being a family matter, Nathan," Vanessa cut in, her tone razor-sharp, "the moment you began using family assets to finance it." Then she reached for the crimson portfolio. The click of the latch echoed like a gunshot. The sound snapped through the room like a judge's gavel, clear, commanding, irreversible. She didn't pull out a thick dossier, just one page. A single glossy sheet. She placed it gently on the table. It was an infographic, simple, elegant, merciless. A web of labeled boxes connected by sharp arrows. A visual autopsy of a scandal. At the top in bold, the Phoenix Initiative, simplified flow of funds. In the center, Langford Global Holdings. From there, arrows extended outward to a dozen smaller entities. Apex Trust, Luxembourg, Bluebell Finance, Cayman, Verita Partners, Panama. And from all of them the final arrow flowed into a box labeled NL Personal Discretionary Fund. It was a blueprint of financial deceit. The anatomy of a fraud so sprawling and complex Nathan never thought it could be unraveled, let alone rendered digestible in one single, devastating page. A breath caught in his throat. It was as if his entire empire, every hidden transfer, every whispered wire was laid bare for the world to see, reduced to colors and arrows and damning clarity. "I always admired your creativity, Nathan," Vanessa said lightly, as if commenting on a piece of modern art. She tapped her finger gently on the diagram. "The way you used the company's pension fund as collateral for that initial loan from the Frankfurt Bank? Genius. A little illegal, under ERISA statutes, but bold." She smiled, perfectly composed. It took 3 forensic accountants to map it all. They said it was the most elegant fraud they had ever seen. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. The pension fund. That was the sacred line. The one you did not cross. Marcus Ellington's eyes widened. He leaned in, peering at the infographic like a pirate stumbling upon a treasure map. "My God," he murmured, reverent and horrified. "Is that the pension fund?" "Nathan, you magnificent bastard." It wasn't praise, it was an epitaph. Nathan stared at the page, the simple lines, the clean boxes, the flow of arrows that pointed straight to his destruction. He couldn't breathe. The entire ballroom seemed to tilt. The chandeliers above swayed like judgmental gods. This was it. The execution stroke. This wasn't just about a divorce or losing a chunk of his assets. This was about prison. This was about obliteration. The name Langford, a name he had spent decades turning into a global monolith, was about to become synonymous with scandal, with criminal disgrace, with Madoff. He looked at Vanessa, really looked. All those years of silence, of quiet meals, of tight smiles and emotionless holidays. He had mistaken it all for weakness. But now he saw it for what it was: observation, data collection. She had been positioned at the quiet center of his life, watching, listening, recording. The portfolio wasn't some hastily assembled threat. It was the endgame to a strategy years in the making. His public parade of Sophie hadn't caused this. It had triggered it. "Vanessa, please," he rasped. It was pitiful. A beggar's whimper. The last remnants of his power had crumbled. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with a deep, profound emptiness. The eyes of a woman who had already mourned. Her love, her marriage, the man she thought he was. "Don't," she said, soft, final. "Don't what, Nathan?" she asked, still gentle but merciless. "Don't show them what you are. You already did that. An hour ago." She lifted the infographic again, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of board members, investors, journalists from the Wall Street Journal, the Times. She didn't raise it like a weapon. She raised it like a receipt. "He told me," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the hushed ballroom, "that it would be best if I stayed home tonight. That my presence would be awkward." She smiled faintly. She was right about that. Vanessa slid the glossy sheet back into its crimson leather sheath, clicked it shut, and stood. The execution was complete. She hadn't just destroyed Nathan. She had made him complicit in his own destruction. His ego, his arrogance, it had been the weapon she'd used to dismantle him. The sound of the portfolio latch closing wasn't just final. It was symbolic. It was the snap of a trapdoor beneath the gallows. The crack of a judge's gavel from which there was no appeal. It was the metallic thud of a coffin lid closing on a life that, until this night, had seemed invincible. Nathan Langford, the mogul, the predator, the self-proclaimed king, stood in the glittering heart of San Francisco's grandest ballroom, undone, utterly, irrevocably. The infographic was gone, tucked away, but its ghost lingered in the eyes of every guest present. It had branded itself into memory, seared onto the collective consciousness of the city's elite. No transaction, no deal, no meeting would ever happen again with his name untainted. Pension fund. Fraud. The words didn't need to be spoken. They clung to the air, dense and suffocating, like smoke from a fire that would never go out, slowly poisoning everything he had ever built. Vanessa stood serene. The red of her gown slashed through the ballroom like a wound. Bold, defiant, victorious. She was no longer just a wife, or a fixture of high society. She had become something else entirely. An event, a force of nature, a reckoning. In less than an hour, without raising her voice, without throwing a glass, without shedding a single tear, she had changed the very fabric of the city. She had shown the world the truth, and the truth had been enough to bring an empire to its knees. Nathan watched her, his mind a maelstrom of disbelief and horror. It was like watching his own life play backward. Every empire, every tower, every acquisition slowly erasing itself. The Hong Kong development, a monument to his own ego, now felt like a house of cards. The alliance with Tanaka, the crown jewel of his Asian dominance, was dead. He could feel the chill of the Japanese tycoon's silent retreat across the ballroom. The awe of his board, the men he had ruled by fear, would rot into panic by morning. The dread he once inspired in rivals would curdle into joy. The sharks were already circling. Everything he was, everything he had, gone. All undone by one sheet of paper, held by the one person he had always dismissed. Vanessa. All that remained was the raw, primal, deeply unfamiliar terror of consequence. And from deep within his chest came a strangled, inhuman sound, a guttural, broken noise, half sob, half scream. The noise of a king, finally brought low. It was part sob, part the groan of a crumbling empire. Nathan stumbled forward, one arm outstretched, a reflex, grasping for the woman who had just obliterated him. Vanessa. The name escaped his lips as a shredded whisper, a plea. His eyes, wild, frantic, scanned the room in search of something solid, something real in the spinning wreckage of his reality. They found Sophie. She had edged her way back into the ballroom, drawn to the irresistible pull of devastation. She lingered near a marble column, half concealed. Her face was frozen, a study in horror and dawning self-centered realization. Her eyes were wide with fear. Not for him, for herself. She wasn't witnessing the fall of a husband or a lover. She was witnessing the collapse of an empire she had bet her entire life on inheriting. And in her panicked expression, Nathan saw no love, no loyalty, just cold recalculation, her future, slipping through her manicured fingers. And suddenly, all of Nathan's panic, his shame, his white-hot fury, coalesced into something ugly and singular. He needed a scapegoat, someone else to blame, because his mind, so long trained to bend reality to his will, could not accept the truth that this ruin was entirely of his own making. His gaze locked onto her. "You," he roared. It was a sound stripped of humanity, feral, raw. His finger shot out in a trembling accusation, as if pointing alone might transfer his guilt. "This is your fault, all of it. You and your greed, your neediness, your constant demands," he mimicked mockingly. "When are you leaving her, Nathan? I deserve more, Nathan. If it wasn't for you, for flaunting you, none of this would have happened." Sophie recoiled as though he had struck her. A collective gasp rose from the room, sharp, involuntary. This was a spectacle no one had anticipated. To be the discarded mistress, common enough. To be publicly humiliated, unpleasant but survivable. But to be blamed openly, cruelly for the collapse of a man now exposed as a criminal? That was a new depth. A spectacular descent into an exclusive circle of social damnation. "Get away from me!" Nathan shouted, voice cracking, hysteria rising like floodwater. "I never want to see your face again. Get out!" He wasn't a king anymore. But in that moment, wild, broken, exiled, he gave the final pathetic order of a fallen monarch, the execution of his favorite. Sophie stood frozen, her once prized beauty now a mask of disbelief and ruin. The silver gown that had sparkled like armor now hung on her like foil, a shimmering shroud. Then a strangled sob, almost silent. She turned and fled, not gliding, not poised, but stumbling through the forest of tables and horrified guests. A social pariah running from her own public immolation. Nathan barely registered her retreat. He had cast Sophie aside, like useless cargo tossed from a sinking ship. Now, every molecule of Nathan's focus was trained on a single point of hope, or doom. Vanessa. He stumbled forward, those last few desperate steps, legs barely functioning. The grand ballroom, the watching crowd, the glittering chandeliers, they all faded into a blur. All that remained was the distance between himself and her. The polished exterior, the millionaire facade, the Titan CEO, the invincible master of markets, hadn't just cracked. It had disintegrated, blown away like ash in a windstorm, revealing what had always existed underneath, a weak, broken man. And then, stripped of pride, stripped of power, Nathan Langford fell to his knees. The sound of his designer trousers hitting the marble echoed like a gunshot in the vaulted silence. Gasps. Stunned silence. Nathan Langford, the man who had never begged, never yielded, not to markets, not to rivals, not even to governments, was kneeling at his wife's feet. "Vanessa, please." He wept. Tears, once unthinkable, poured down his face in a hot, unchecked stream, mingling with the sweat at his brow. He reached, not for her hand, but for the hem of her red dress. His hands trembled violently, barely able to grip the silk. "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. My God, Vanessa, I'm so sorry." The room held its breath. It was a vision no one could have imagined. Grotesque, raw, unbearably human. Marcus Ellington stood at a distance, arms folded, watching with cold satisfaction. This wasn't just downfall. This was art. "She meant nothing," Nathan sobbed. The words fell out of him, desperate, slurred. "She was a mistake, a meaningless distraction, an idiotic mistake. It's always been you, Vanessa. Always. I see that now. I was a fool, blind, arrogant. I took you for granted. I took everything for granted." He looked up, his face a ruin. Tears, shame, ruin, a caricature of remorse. "We can fix this," he begged. "I'll do anything. The house in Napa, the Paris apartment, every account, a new agreement in your favor, ironclad. Whatever you want, Vanessa. Just, please, don't release it. Don't ruin me." A pause, a crack in his voice. "Don't ruin us." Vanessa looked down at the man kneeling before her, clutching the hem of her dress like a drowning child. What she saw wasn't just Nathan, it was the wreckage of their marriage, the smoking ruins of a life she had once believed in, that he had so casually, so repeatedly set ablaze. She felt a flicker, something faint, buried deep. But it wasn't pity. It was the final dying breath of a love that had already long since expired. A slow death by neglect and 1,000 small, sharp betrayals. It was the ghost of a feeling, finally leaving the house it had haunted far too long. She reached down, her movement slow, measured, and for a wild, desperate second, Nathan hoped she might help him up, that she might offer mercy. But instead, Vanessa gently, firmly peeled his trembling hands from her gown. Her touch wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was clinical, detached, like handling a fragile but contaminated object she no longer recognized. "Us," she said. Her voice was quiet, preternaturally calm. But behind its softness was the pressure of 15 years of swallowed pain. "There is no us, Nathan. You burned that bridge the first time you lied, years ago. And you kept dancing in the ashes, so enamored with your own reflection that you never noticed when I stopped smelling the smoke." She glanced around, at the stunned, silent witnesses, then back down at the broken man at her feet. "You think this was about her?" she asked, genuine curiosity laced in her tone. "Or the one before her? Or the money? Or even the cheating? No, this is about the fact that you stopped seeing me, entirely. For a decade, I was a ghost in our home. I ran your world, Nathan. I managed the machine so you could be free to tear it all down." She paused, "And tonight I just wanted to make sure you saw me. One last time." He kept pleading, his words slurring into a low, incoherent stream of promises, apologies, begging. But it was meaningless now. Vanessa let him weep. She let him kneel. She let the city watch. She let the silence stretch, a moment of shared, exquisite humiliation that would forever define him. Not in court, not in headlines, but in memory. This was the punishment, the death of his myth. Then she took one small, deliberate step back, and in doing so, opened a chasm, one he would never cross again. She held the crimson portfolio in her hand, her last and only tether to Nathan Langford. "As for this," Vanessa said, her voice cool, precise, unshaken as she glanced at the portfolio, "this isn't a bargaining chip. You have nothing left to bargain with. This," she paused, the faintest wry smile tugging at her lips, "is my retirement plan, my severance package, from a long, thankless career. A job," she added, turning to look directly at him, "that I hereby resign from, effective immediately." Then she turned her back to him. No hesitation, no dramatics, just finality. Each step she took toward the great oak doors was steady, controlled, regal. She didn't look back. The red of her gown remained the last vibrant thing in a world that had turned bleak and gray for Nathan Langford. She was walking away, from a marriage, from a legacy, from a gilded prison built from deception and ego. She was walking toward uncertainty, but it was hers alone, bought and paid for with his secrets. She had entered the room a whisper. She left a legend. The doors opened, almost reverently, and she stepped into the cool, bracing air of the San Francisco night, leaving behind the smoldering wreckage of a man and the eerie silence of a ballroom still echoing with ruin. And so, Vanessa Langford walked out, not as a victim, but as the architect of her own liberation. She didn't just exact revenge. She reclaimed her power, her name, her future, all with one devastatingly elegant move. So the story is over, our wonderful friends. Are you still here at this hour? If you've stayed with us through the end, then maybe, just maybe, something in this story has stirred something in you. And I want to say this. Look, this wasn't just drama. This wasn't just spectacle. This was a reminder, a lesson, a reckoning wrapped in red silk and silence. Vanessa's story teaches us one essential truth. Dignity is never loud, but it is absolute. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't beg, she didn't threaten, she just stood her ground, reclaimed her story, and walked out with her head high and her hands clean. Life doesn't always hand us fairness. Sometimes it hands us betrayal, invisibility, heartbreak. But we are not defined by what happens to us. We are defined by what we do next. As the poet Rumi once said, the wound is the place where the light enters you. So if you're here, at this late hour, carrying your own wounds, maybe from a relationship, maybe from being unseen, unheard, underestimated, know this. You can rise. You can rewrite your ending. You don't have to shout. You don't have to explain. You just have to walk, one step, then another, toward what is yours. Power isn't in revenge. Power is in walking away with peace, with purpose, and with your name still intact. If this story touched something in you, if it echoed in your own quiet corners, then share it. Like this video. Send it to someone who might need to see it right now. And please, subscribe for more stories like this. Stories that aren't just entertainment, but a mirror to the truth we often bury. We'll be here telling them, one unforgettable story at a time.